What happens when a classic game studio takes the point-and-click out of point-and-click adventure games? Hi, I'm Kyle out of New York.
I'm Carson, here in LA, and this is the Video Game Canon,
where we try to determine, once and for all, the greatest games of all time.
Today we're talking about Grim Fandango, a 3D adventure game developed by LucasArts in 1998, and it was under the project lead of Tim Schafer, who's now of Double Fine Games. In 2015, Grim Fandango saw a remaster onto current-gen consoles, PC, and mobile platforms.
In Grim Fandango, you play as Manny Calavera, a travel agent in the land of the dead, where he's working to pay off a debt so he can enter the Ninth Underworld. Along the way, he uncovers a corrupt organization, joins a resistance movement, and tracks down a missing woman, all with the help of speed demon Glottis.
So the question is, does Grim Fandango belong in the video game canon? We'll try to decide this by looking at the game's innovation, accessibility, storytelling, consistency, and artistry.
So in terms of the game's innovation, I think that Grim Fandango does a lot for the adventure game genre. Earlier on in LucasArts' career, they did point-and-click adventure games like Secret of Monkey Island and Day of the Tentacle. The point-and-click adventures had 12 or so verbs that you could pick from whenever you were pixel hunting and trying to figure out what to do. So you could push or pull or talk to or walk to any given object. What Grim Fandango does instead is it gets rid of all of that. And in the original release, point and click wasn't even an option. Manny would just look around and you would have a couple of buttons to interact. One to use an object, one to look at it, and one to pick it up. So it really simplifies the entire experience and I think makes it a lot easier to use.
And beyond being easier, it helps you get more immersed in the world because instead of directing Manny's attention to things that he should be paying attention to, you're actually controlling him, and it helps you identify with his story and travel with him along this 4-year journey. So
speaking of how the game played, what was your experience working through this game and sort of picking it up after nearly 20 years since its release?
So my first experience playing Grim Fandango was exciting because I hadn't experienced the game in its original form, but the remastered version, which is what I checked out first, has the capability to represent the game as it originally appeared before the remaster, which was a nice thing for them to include. But I first noticed it being extremely visually striking, and it's easy to get into. It encourages exploration right off the bat, but it also doesn't waste any time in demanding a little more curiosity of the game player to hunt out the story and interact with the world around you.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you played the remaster. If we had made this video a couple of years ago, we would have a much harder time with the game's accessibility because it legally wouldn't be accessible. Because of the game's release and the fact that Disney bought LucasArts, this game just sort of disappeared for years and years, and so we're really lucky that we were able to play a remastered version. I know that I played with tank controls and with the original graphics because I'm kind of a purist like that, but I think it's great that they've updated it for people who have a harder time getting into it.
I couldn't latch onto the tank controls because, I don't know, maybe I've given up on my point and click roots, but being able to play this game with the analog stick and just move around the world, even more so like I was experiencing the game through Manny, was what allowed me to enjoy the game the most. But to each their own, you purist. So one of the first things I heard about Grim Fandango before I even played it was how in-depth and amazing the story was. Why is the story so great? You know, what makes it stand out in gaming history? What was your experience with the story in this game?
I think one of the main ways that Grim Fandango innovates in its storytelling is that its storytelling and its gameplay are so completely married. Literally the same conversations that you have just for getting plot across and trying to figure out what you're doing are the same exact conversations that give you clues to solving puzzles and progressing in the story that way. And I think it's telling that a lot of the achievements in the remaster are based around unlocking different dialogue options and specifically funny lines that the developers were particularly proud of, because so much of the game is hinging on the idea that just the dialogue options are a reward in themselves. Like the title of the game and like its explanation is hidden away in a dialogue option that some players might not ever uncover, but they are so confident in the fact that people will want to spend more time with these characters and figuring out who they are and how they fit into this world, that it's just second nature to go through every single option and spend a lot of time just sort of listening to people, which I think is fascinating.
No, that's a great point. But there are times when that dialogue sort of disagreed with the pacing of the storytelling, in that I would be exploring the world and talking to somebody in a different order than would ultimately be beneficial for the story. So I wouldn't be getting the full picture, and I would be hunting for answers, I think, in the wrong way, at least in the way I experienced the game. So to each their own, but that was a point of struggle for me, that there was so much freedom and the clues were all over the place, and how you talk to people was so abstract. Even within the conversations, you could follow a line of dialogue with them, abandon that line, start talking about something completely different, and then take up that line of dialogue again as you wanted to. So if the player wants to...
I agree. It certainly isn't realistic. There was one other problem I had sort of along the same lines, where so much of the story is so high stakes, and they expect you to have this really fast pace to your discovery, but a lot of the time you're going to get stuck on puzzles and not have the sort of urgency that the story demands. So I found a little disconnect there. But overall, I think that the story does a great job of mixing together these film noir influences and the Day of the Dead sort of cultural aspect. It brings up the working man and the system in a way that makes Manny a really believable but still totally charming anti-hero. And I think a lot of the dialogue options let you play that out in whatever way you want, where you can choose to be totally against the system and a revolutionary all the way, or you can just be doing that because it's helping you get out of a terrible situation.
Yeah, that's something I liked about the dialogue, was that the characters they chose to fill the world with were so much more than the archetypes they set them up to be. Because with the noir genre, there's certain expectations of the kinds of characters that would show up. The secretary, the mob bosses, the shady people, you're not sure if you should trust them. But they took those archetypes and gave those characters so many more extra elements that added some dimension to them and added some believability that grounded what would otherwise be a probably pretty ridiculous feeling game without much weight to it, and gave it some real gravity, as you said, with like real world issues of the working man, labor issues, gambling, drinking. All of these are addressed in what was, supposedly a children's game.
I'm up to my ass in azaleas.
I'm up to my ass in azaleas.
Yes. And the frequent occasions where Manny outright flirts with people. The security guard, where they go into the back room of the security office to, go for a strip search, which ends up just being a frustrated conversation so that Manny can get something for his mission. But all those implications are not hidden at all. It was very adult themes. It was very upfront about that.
So let's talk about if this game sort of keeps up that level throughout the entire thing. I think that year 2 is definitely the pinnacle of this game, and I don't think that a lot else lives up to it. There are definitely excellent parts throughout the game, but I think that the design works best in that second year, specifically because it's much wider and there are a lot more options available to you. So you can be following several different puzzles at once and sort of piecing them together bit by bit as you get leads and come up with more clues. So if you ever get stuck on something, there's always something else in your inventory that can give you an idea that you can go pursue while you're still thinking it over. And there are these huge wide spaces that really let you think as you're crossing them. It can be sort of a maze to get around where you need to go, but all of that time is spent well, in my opinion, because you're always trying to figure out what you're going to do next. For me, gameplay-wise, that second section is far and above the best piece of the game.
I know the bridge you were talking about, the bridge that goes between the cat track and the morgue was one of those moments where the game lets you step back from all those intricate conversations and puzzle solving and just kind of enjoy the atmosphere and try to figure out what's going on in this world. So there were a lot of those moments.
Yeah. I think narratively, there are moments in year 4 that work a lot better for me as the story's wrapping up, because it allows the writers to take on the themes of the afterlife a lot more directly, because he's pretty much at the threshold, and you have to really start thinking about what does it mean to let go and say goodbye and sort of walk into paradise. And they really effectively bring back different characters that you've seen throughout the game. Even if they're tiny bit parts, suddenly they have this emotional resonance that you never thought they would.
Let's talk a little bit more about the artistry from a sound perspective, from a visual perspective, because I was blown away by the voice acting of this game.
Oh, yeah.
And a really, really competent cast of established actors. Tony Plana as Manny Calavera, the protagonist of the game, so the voice you hear most of the time is very grounded, believable. He's playing the genre, but like I said before, with this element of depth to it. And how his attitude progresses, of course, depends on the dialogue options you choose. But you have him journeying with Glottis, who's this, by contrast, a very loud, boisterous character. He is a demon and ends up not only modifying cars, but exhibiting a drinking problem, a gambling problem, and high proficiency for piano, which was not something I was expecting in year 2, but one of my favorite parts. And a fun fact, the one and only Tom Kane is a major voice part of this game as Raoul, the French waiter, and he's the announcer for the Cat track.
5 minutes to post.
This is a guy who went on to be voices on Star Wars and Call of Duty, a host of other animated shows. So his voice always stands out to me as somebody who's been a fan of voice arts, but visually as well. I mean, Kyle, if you want to talk about the visual aspects of this game and where it blends cultures to create a new look.
One of the most important things about the visuals of this game is that clearly the people making it cared and put a lot of love into it. So much of the Calavera Cafe in Rubacava is pulled directly out of Casablanca.
Yeah, absolutely. And in year 1, in the agency, right outside the building, there's that long string of handkerchiefs that go up to the top of the building. A building that's set in the Art Deco style, and the entire city is this sort of grayscale, concrete, plain building setting. It's very serious. But at the same time, you have all these elements of Dia de los Muertos exhibited with gemmed skulls set into the buildings. There's a parade going on, and you have these multicolored handkerchiefs stringing a flight path right up to the top of the building that is never really explained. But it's these little quirks about the atmosphere that really tie these cultures together, these styles together, and establish the world as something that I haven't really seen anything like this in games before. So definitely worth highlighting all those moments.
Yeah, it's very much about death, but never really too grim to
I see what you did there.
The worst word possible. But sort of in the same Dia de los Muertos tradition, it's super vibrant and colorful, even when it's borrowing from the film noir tradition. I also wanted to talk about the sound design a little bit more in conjunction with storytelling. First off, the music is incredible throughout the entire game.
Yes.
But also, just the sound design brings the world to life completely. There's a moment in the very first environment where you're walking down an alley, and spoiler alert, there's a secret Lost Souls Alliance hideout underneath your feet, and there's a little metal grate where the elevator comes up, and you can hear that it's hollow underneath there, but just those little aspects that suggest where the story is going and solutions to puzzles, like purely through sound design, and it just makes the world feel so much more lived in.
And for a game that was brand new into the 3D adventure world, if there were any aspect of the design that I would expect to be more reserved or less developed, it would have been sound design. But it was completely immersive, and it's difficult in a 3D space, especially when it's your first foray into that format of a fully enriched 3D world, to have sound localized and be able to communicate footsteps down a hallway, left, right, in every angle. And like in that alleyway, being able to walk down and and have the reverb of the plate that you walk over and experience that distance. It can be difficult to achieve, but like you said, it's completely rich, it's completely fulfilled, and it immerses you in the world even more. So that was one of my favorite aspects.
So, do you think that we've discussed enough and that we can make a consensus on whether or not Grim Fandango belongs in our brand new video game canon?
I think it's time to decide. We've covered all those categories, and for how this game tells a story, for how this game creates a world and ropes in the player and demands a certain amount of curiosity and exploration from the player, and for the fact that it accomplished this rich world building from a infantile standpoint of the genre, being a 3D adventure game from a studio that hadn't really done that before, in a world of video games that hadn't seen a lot before, unless we count like Quake and Doom, but this was in a world of its own in terms of storytelling. And for those reasons, I absolutely vote to include Grim Fandango in our video game canon.
Yeah, and admittedly, it would be kind of terrible if we had our first episode and chose not to include anything in the canon.
Exactly.
So, congratulations, Grim Fandango. Your giant novelty check is in the mail.
Because I know they've been waiting all these 20 years to be included in our special little video game canon. And as the list grows, and as we pick our next games, hopefully it'll become something of a exclusive standing for the very best games of all time.
Yeah, and now they've done it. They've made it into our video, and so, like, they can just chill out. I'll let LucasArts know.
Yep.
They don't need to bother making any more games.
It's all over now, yeah. This is what they've been working towards. So now is the time to decide what game comes next in the video game canon.
So we're going to try a thing where each of us nominates a game, and then you, in the comments below, can vote on which one of those two we are actually going to play. So Carson, what did you bring today? What do you want to play in the future?
I gotta bring Tetris to the table. It's a classic, and in the terms of greatest video games of all time, it's gotta be a contender. I want to throw it into the canon, especially because I've revisited it lately in some times of puzzle neediness. I needed to get my hands on some puzzles, and Tetris was there for it. So my vote goes to Tetris.
Nice. I would be totally content playing Tetris. But since Cuphead just came out, I am itching to play a punishing platformer. So I'm going to nominate Mega Man 2 and hopefully get some other good chiptune nonsense up in my brain.
I can never say no to a good platformer. I mean, one of my first retro games ever, retro because I was not born in the 80s, so I can't say it was just my own childhood of gaming, but it was Contra 3. So in terms of punishing platformers, I would not complain if we got to do Mega Man, so let's see what they choose. Until next time, this is Video Game Canon.